1963, a year that would change the world. The assassination of President John Kennedy, civil rights leader Medgar Evers killed in his own driveway, the March on Washington, and throughout the South, nonviolent protests were met with savage beatings and arrests.
There was a lot of violence. You know, I was part of Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964, and there had been lots of people killed in Mississippi.
While violence raged across the South, in Atlanta, which described itself as a city too busy to hate, city leaders, black and white, took a different path.
They wanted to maintain peace. They didn't want to see a Birmingham, Montgomery, or Selma. And I think that's what saved Atlanta and spared Atlanta. You didn't see the racial violence. You didn't see people using doors and fire hoses.
And throughout it all, one organization that stood as a fierce defender of civil liberties for Georgians, the American Civil Liberties Union of Georgia, better known as ACLU of Georgia.
This group, the ACLU, seems to be probably one of the greatest contributors to breakdown of constitutional government and the right to private property and free enterprise.
What started as a very small-scale operation in 1963 has grown into a full-scale, comprehensive legal and advocacy powerhouse organization.
We had a real community of people working together. I mean, our office was very small. You know, for the first 5 or 6 years, it was just me and a half-time person in the office.
Over the past 60 years, the ACLU of Georgia has been involved in some of the most important civil rights cases in Georgia's history, from landmark cases to reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, prison reform, and voting rights. In the 60s, the Georgia legislature was dominated by rural counties and mostly older white men. The U.S. Supreme Court had come down with a series of cases announcing the one-man, one-vote rule. The Georgia legislature resisted changing how they created voting districts and fought compliance. They would lose.
The first time since Reconstruction, Atlanta had more representation and elected black members of the General Assembly.
The Vietnam War divided America and nearly ended the political career of Julian Bond before it got started.
I do not advocate that people should break laws. What I simply tried to say was that I admired the courage of someone who could act on his convictions, knowing that he faced pretty stiff consequences.
An outspoken critic, Bond was denied his seat in the legislature and called a communist. The ACLU of Georgia fought back.
So that case went to the United States Supreme Court, and he ended up, of course, getting seated in the Georgia legislature.
During the 70s, the civil rights movement underwent change. Many prominent leaders believed that it was time to move from the movement into politics. So in 1970, Young ran as a Democrat for the 5th District seat in the U.S. House of Representatives from Georgia, but was narrowly defeated. He contemplated running again, but in reapportionment, the legislature moved his neighborhood out of Atlanta's 5th District and into a district with rural Noonan.
So it was 38% black in the old way. And when they put me with Noonan, it was like 16% black. It was the American Civil Liberties Union of Georgia that took on that case and won it.
In 1972, Young ran again and won. After the ACLU intervened, the lines were redrawn for Southwest Atlanta to include most of Fulton County, making it a winnable district for Young.
If it had not been for that court case and those two lawyers, I couldn't have won the 5th Congressional District.
In 1974, the ACLU of Georgia took up the case of black inmates in Reedsville who were being denied their right to religious worship.
The Department of Corrections had a rule which said that an inmate could not receive visits from a minister unless the minister was of the same faith as the inmate had been when he entered prison. It was to keep black Muslim ministers out of the prison system.
Remar filed a lawsuit in federal court which granted the prosecution relief and led the Department of Corrections to repeal the rule, effectively establishing the rights of inmates to practice their religion freely.
I got this anonymous call one day that there was a lighted cross that was heavily lit that was placed on, I think, Black Rock Mountain up above Clayton, Georgia, and in the state park up there. It overlooked the city, and so he went to court to challenge it and to try to make the point that we were trying to protect religious liberty, and we won that case.
All we asked was it be moved to private property, and the chamber refused to do so.
The 1980s was a time of social change and legal challenges in Georgia. In 1982, the ACLU of Georgia fought against Kennesaw's mandatory gun law, arguing that it violated individual liberties. Their efforts highlighted the importance of balancing individual rights with public safety. In 1986, the ACLU of Georgia took on the landmark case of McCleskey versus Kemp, challenging racial disparities in the application of the death penalty.
If it was a black person who killed a white person, they were something like more than 3 times likely to get a death sentence than a white person killing a black person.
Although the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against the ACLU, the case shed light on the systematic racial biases in our criminal justice system. For some, high school football is more than a game, it's a religion. In 1989, student Doug Jager filed a lawsuit to end a long-standing tradition of pregame football prayer practice in Douglas County. The ACLU supported his fight for the separation of church and state, ultimately leading to a court ruling that ended the unconstitutional prayer practice.
And he was a very gutsy guy because there was a lot of opposition to what he was doing.
Liza, some are outraged, and there's already a threat of at least one lawsuit.
Yeah, we're definitely staying on top of this story. ACLU of Georgia telling 11 Alive that they plan to use every legal means at their disposal to block the law. Now, transgender youth and their parents have heavily lobbied against the bill.
The ACLU of Georgia has been a relentless supporter of LGBTQ rights, fighting against discrimination, worked to secure legal protections, and advocated for equality in areas such as employment, public accommodations, and marriage.
As a lesbian woman who is married to a wonderful woman with 2 beautiful children, I wish I knew why people were so scared and terrified of us. We're no different than they are, and love is love.
Decades after racial integration, Georgia schools' new punitive tolerance programs were pushing some students out of classrooms and into the prison system. The ACLU of Georgia fought to dismantle this shameful school-to-prison pipeline that disproportionately affects the marginalized youth.
We're ultimately able to resolve through a settlement, and it systematically changed the process in which kids were provided with the due process when there was potentially an issue, a behavioral issue.
The ACLU was a fierce defender of the First Amendment, even when it involves groups like the Ku Klux Klan. In 2012, the Klan was rejected by the state's Adopt a Highway program, citing First Amendment free speech violations. The nonpartisan ACLU took up the case, saying free speech is not limited to only those we agree with.
I do indeed find it offensive, but it's not up to me and it's not up to the state to decide what messages are acceptable and what messages are not acceptable.
In 2017, the ACLU of Georgia played a significant role in challenging the Muslim ban, a series of executive orders issued by the Trump administration to restrict travel and immigration from several predominantly Muslim countries.
The airport worked with us and they set up rooms for attorneys to talk to these individuals who are coming in transit to give them legal advice to actually help.
From intervening in the Muslim ban to battling new and aggressive tactics in voter suppression, the ACLU of Georgia is steadfast in continuing its legacy, defending civil liberties, fighting for justice, and ensuring equal rights for all.
We are not going away. We are going to keep standing and keep fighting until justice is done, not only in this case, but also so that no one ever has to fear jogging the streets anywhere in the state of Georgia.
Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old black man, went jogging through a South Georgia neighborhood. He was chased down and killed by 3 white men who claimed they were trying to make a citizen's arrest. The 3 were found guilty of murder. Georgia ACLU, along with other organizations, brought pressure on the governor, who would later sign a law to repeal the citizen's arrest statute.
We have a number of tools at our disposal. I think it's one of the things that makes
the current iteration of the ACLU so impactful.
That impact was on display when Sean Young negotiated a provision in the law allowing private buildings to be at early voting locations, opening a way for State Farm Arena and the Woodruff Arts Center to serve thousands of voters.
Our organization spearheaded a poll worker recruitment program that was very successful.
Most recently, our work in voting rights, which ultimately led to the 2020 election when 5 million Georgians were able to vote.
I've seen unfair maps play out in front of me when my dad, Andrew Young, was drawn out of the 5th Congressional District right here in Atlanta following the 1970 census. How would you draw districts if you believe that the diversity of our state is our strength?
Protect the vote! Say what? Protect the vote! We are marching for jobs, for freedom, for peace, and for the right to vote in this country where my family were held in slavery for 5 generations.
Who would have ever thought that 50 plus years later we would still be fighting for the protection of voting rights and equal access to the ballot?
Along with voting rights, protecting women's reproductive rights has been a long-standing priority.
As you know, when Governor Kemp signed into law a bill violating women's constitutional rights in Georgia, we promised we would see him in court.
It's not just enough for the people in power to take the rights away. Now they want to criminalize it.
We are seeing the state legislature, the governor, U.S. Supreme Court that is rolling back rights that were well established.
This is not ACLU Georgia's first court challenge. Back in 1973, they, along with the national office, went before the Supreme Court with 2 lawsuits, Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton.
A lawyer named Margie Pitts-Haynes, who was the local counsel for those, and working with the ACLU National Legal Department as well. But you know, they were the challenge to the abortion laws, and the two were combined, and the Supreme Court, you know, held in the Doe case that you know, a woman had a right to choose.
The ACLU of Georgia chapter has come a long way since its modest beginnings in 1963. From a small and dedicated group of activists, they've grown into a powerhouse organization.
We had a member in every one of Georgia's 159 counties, and as we like to say, a card-carrying member of the ACLU in every one of Georgia's 159 counties.
ACLU is not an effective organization without the support of its members.
As the ACLU of Georgia looks to the future, their commitment to protecting civil liberties remains as strong as ever.
You deserve the right to be you. And I believe that is what the ACLU Georgia stands for.
I was trained in civil rights advocacy and citizenship at one of the citizenship schools that were developed to train people like Fannie Lou Hamer. I went down there with my dad as a 6-year-old. And I have always believed that I was accountable to those people, and that none of the freedom that we enjoy today would have been possible without the people in the rural South who stood up for civil rights at a time when they were literally risking their lives to do so.